Hope you enjoyed last week's episode, Jonah chapter 3, where we looked at Jonah's response. Now this week we're going to be looking at Jonah chapter 4, and this one is looking at the exchange between Jonah and God. And if you remember the last episode, Jonah he done a bad mind sermon. He had to preach and to say to the Ninevites what God was about to do, but Jonah wanted to give the least amount of information possible because deep down he wanted God to wipe them out. So we see at the end of chapter 3, God has relented. He's not destroyed Nineveh. And so now we're going to go into chapter 4, where we see what now follows on from the end of that chapter. So I'm going to read it again. It's only it's a short chapter, about 11 verses. And then we're going to see what happens. And also we're going to see how this book ends. It's kind of an abrupt ending, but it's interesting. So let's get into the last chapter. So from verse 1, but to Jonah, this seemed very wrong, and he became angry. He prayed to the Lord, "Isn't this what I said, Lord, when I was still at home? That is what I tried to forestall by fleeing to Tarshish. I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in love, a God who relents from sending calamity. Now, Lord, take away my life, for it is better for me to die than to live." But the Lord replied, "Is it right for you to be angry?" Jonah had gone out and sat at a place east of the city. There he made himself a shelter, sat in its shade and waited to see what would happen to the city. Then the Lord God provided a leafy plant and made it grow up over Jonah to give shade for his head to ease his discomfort. And Jonah was very happy about the plant. But at dawn the next day, God provided a worm which chewed the plant so that it withered. When the sun rose, God provided a scorching east wind, and the sun blazed on Jonah's head so that he grew faint. He wanted to die and said, "It would be better for me to die than to live." But God said to Jonah, "Is it right for you to be angry about the plant?" "It is," he said, "and I'm so angry I wish I were dead." But the Lord said, "You have been concerned about this plant, though you did not tend it or make it grow. It sprang up overnight and died overnight. And should I not be concerned for the great city of Nineveh, in which there are more than 120,000 people who cannot tell their right hand from their left, and also many animals?" And then that's it. That's how the book ends. Abrupt ending like that. But hear what's interesting about this book, or in particular in regards to this chapter. So we see that there's the exchange between Jonah and God. Now I want to look at both of those exchanges. First, we're going to look at Jonah. Then we're going to look at God. Now remember what's happened, yeah? So chapter 1, Jonah's told already, boom, go to Nineveh, proclaim to them this and that. Jonah doesn't do it. He dips off and goes in the other direction. Storm happens, gets thrown overboard. Then the fish comes into the equation. God provides a fish. Jonah's swallowed by the fish. Then Jonah kind of talks about his journey down into the bottom of the sea and all the rest of it. And then at the end of chapter 2, he's vomited up by the fish. Then in chapter 3, Jonah reaches Nineveh, big city, meant to go through preaching. He only goes one day into the city, and then it's about the whole exaggeration. How large is this city really? But then Jonah preaches perhaps one of the shortest sermons ever. In Hebrew, it's about 4 or 5 words. Then we see Jonah realizes the way and how the people responds that God ain't going to send destruction. And then we get into this part now, where Jonah's now vexed. But then what's interesting, if you look closely, Jonah's vexed, and now he leaves the city, and now he's sitting on the outside of the city. And what's interesting is Jonah's watching, you know, like he's watching thinking, is God going to change his mind? Maybe he's going to destroy the city. And he's waiting to see if this is really going to happen. Now, what's also important to remember is that the office of a prophet isn't necessarily just to determine whether or not they can predict the future. But remember, in that sermon that Jonah preaches, where he says 40 more days and Nineveh will be overthrown, that word overthrown in the Hebrew is ambiguous. It doesn't necessarily mean destruction, but it can mean a turning as well. It can mean a turning around. So what it does, it invokes the fact that the prophet's office will still stay intact. So if it's destroyed, boom, it means the same thing. If it repents and it turns, it can also mean the same thing. So Jonah's like sitting there waiting. Why? I'm thinking, is God really going to let this happen? And then we see that Jonah's watching and God asks him a question. What is it right for you to be angry? The first response, Jonah doesn't say anything. Then in the morning, we see a plan. God provides a plan to give Jonah shade. Jonah's happy now because it's and then also location is quite interesting here. That here it's kind of a desert. It's a hot climate, but he gets a bit of shade and relief. But then what's interesting, we see that God not only provides the plant, but then God provides a worm to eat the plant, and God provides the scorching heat as well. And there's a contrast where we see in chapter 1 that God provides a storm as well. So there's a sense that God provides a kind of a sense of judgment, but also a sense of deliverance as well. So here we can see God provides the shade, but then also he provides the worm and the scorching heat. In chapter 1, God provides the storm, but then he also provides the fish as well. So we see some really interesting parallels and contrasts here, what's happening within this short book. Then we see Jonah kind of tells God how he's really feeling. But what's also interesting, we see Jonah again say that he wants to die. Now, I remember when I said in the first chapter 1, I said, I asked the question, is Jonah suicidal? Now, I know a lot of people don't really want to tackle and answer that question. And we think, nah, man, no biblical person can be that way inclined or to have them things. And we also see these things as kind of taboo. Like we think like people always have to have things together. But in this short book, 4 times we see Jonah mentions that he wants to die, that he's so vexed with the fact that he has to go and preach to his oppressors that he doesn't want to do it and he'd rather be dead. 4 times we see Jonah talking about he'd rather be dead than to be living. Now this is something that I think is important for us to kind of get to grips with this notion of suicidal tendencies and to have those kind of frank conversations and not make people feel away. And I know I've said it before, but it seems to be an important theme throughout this book where Jonah keeps repeating how he's feeling and he's not holding back, especially his feelings about what he thinks God should do. So then Jonah makes it clear his position, his stance. Now let's look at God's response and how God responds to Jonah. And even before we get to the end of the book, just the initial responses that God gives. God asks Jonah a question: is it right for you to be angry? But then Jonah doesn't respond, and then God asks him again a second time, is it right for you to be angry? And the reason why he asks him that, because the first time he asked, Jonah doesn't respond, but then when God provides shade, relief for Jonah, but then when God provides the destruction of that shade, why is it that now it's an issue for Jonah? And then God uses that to ask the question, well, as much as you didn't provide the plant, it was me that provided. You didn't care where it come from. You only care now that it doesn't benefit you. Now this doesn't benefit you. Now there's an issue. Now there's a problem. But what about the same thing for the Ninevites? Just because you don't see the benefit of that people, why should they not also survive? Why should I not have mercy upon them? But then how the book, and remember when I said about God's provision in how, and this is something where we probably don't like to talk about. And I know I had an interesting response on one of my TikTok videos where a young brother kind of, he questioned one of my 1 minute Bible breakdowns. It was around the resurrection. And his whole point was it didn't make sense. And when I looked on his TikTok page, he used to be a Christian and now he's not. So he advocates about the Christian faith and he kind of argues against the Christian faith, saying that it doesn't make sense, it's not logical. And I thought it's quite interesting that what people will use is, why does God not intervene when things are going bad? And that's the argument a lot of people want to have. Well, if suffering happens, is this happen? Why don't God stop and do anything? And I think this book, if anything, it really makes us have to question the purpose and the nature of God at times. Why would God provide goodness in one sense, but then also provide judgment? And these are the things we don't want to talk about, we don't want to tackle, we don't want to have to wrestle with it. It's like we either God is either one or the other. But here we can see, hold on, God provides judgment, but then he also provides deliverance and salvation. Then he provides salvation and deliverance, but then he provides judgment and asks the question. But then at the end of the book, God asks Jonah a question and leaves it. Is it right for me not to deliver these people who don't even know their left from their right hand and the animals? And then the book just ends. And then I think that's kind of classic in Jewish literature, where sometimes it's not just about having a straightforward yes or no. It leaves you lingering and asking deeper questions like, what does this then really mean? What is God communicating to us? What do we have to take from this particular book, from this particular event, and who God is, and also how we navigate and deal with certain people, or deal with people in general? And I'm not giving no answers here. I'm just leaving it like the book is intended for us to do, just to let it linger. But the question remains, what do we do when we're confronted with an issue, with a situation that goes against everything that we believe and what we feel and what we think should be done? And then God asks us a question that makes us have to think deeply and differently. So I'm going to leave it there. I beg you, read over the book again. It's a short book, but trust me, it's powerful, and there's a whole heap for us to take from it. So bless ya. So at the end of this, we see that Jonah, we don't know what happens after this. We just see a question that God asks and leaves, and then that's it. So I hope you go through it again, have a look and see for yourself what God is saying to you. So till next time, we'll look at something totally different. So I hope you enjoyed it. Peace.
Thank you for listening to this content. If you liked it, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and make a comment down below. Or even more so, check out our website, www.affinityextra.com,